I'm going to stagger around a little bit and then probably sit down, but it's wonderful to be back in Adelaide. I have a long history with this city, and it's because of the great excellence of Australian ecology and ecologists. When Anne and I came to Australia for the first time, we spent 1965-66, the academic year, here working with and attracted to the lab of Charles Burke. Some of you probably may recall his name. He was certainly one of the two top ecologists in the world at the time. And I think just as it is today, per capita, the best ecological science in the world is done in Australia. It so happened that the classic book that was given to me as a gift in, I think, 1955, The Distribution and Abundance of Animals, was written by Charles and Andy Andrewartha, who was at Adelaide. And we came to Adelaide to meet and consult with Andrewartha, I was so impressed with the fact that there was a tiny little British town in Australia. It has changed as I come back, but the excellence is still here. I'm even told that Corey Bradshaw is on the faculty of Flinders University, which means it's a center of ecological research just because of his brilliant presence. Those are the last nice things I'm going to say tonight. Because there's nothing more important, I think, than getting scientists more involved, and I don't mean more than Corey is, but scientists in general more involved in trying to solve these problems. The situation in the United States, I hope you understand, is almost beyond belief. We finally have moved to a full-scale cacistocracy. Those of you who are not political scientists should know that cacistocracy is government by the least competent, the least moral people in the society. And we have achieved that now in our executive branch at a level that I would not have believed could exist 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Australia has the potential. I was told that there's actually, you may not believe this, a high official in the Australian government who is a stable moron and actually showed up with a hunk of coal to praise it in the public. Now, that may be false. Nobody could be that stupid, but you never can tell. Your country may be moved. I should say, I love Australia. I should say our country, because I've spent about 5 years here. I've done field work in almost every corner of Australia. It's a great country, and it's a disgrace, the people you're allowing to run it, just like it's a disgrace in the States. I don't know how closely you guys follow what's going on in the States, but it is beyond belief. So, first of all, I want to follow in the footsteps of Jim Hansen, who was he and Schneider were the front line of alerting people to the climate situation. I'm going to sit down, I think, before I fall down. Excuse my clunk. What can I tell you? Aging is non-linear. That's my advice. Always hold on to the banister. Anyway, Jim sent a paper to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in the States talking about dangerous climate change. And they came back at him and said, we're not going to allow you to use that title because it's too emotional, dangerous. And Jim said, bullshit. I'm going to use that title, and got into a huge fight and finally got it in. But he then wrote an article about scientific reticence, that scientists overall are much too reticent to tell the public the truth. They know what's going on, but they, A, want to be sure they're in consensus, that they've got a consensus view, and that they don't make waves. Well, it is time for waves, and more scientists are saying it. In the last year or so, we've had a statement from, I think it's 11,000 scientists backing up on the 25th anniversary of the statement that was made in 1993, the world's scientists warning to humanity, the statement on population by all the academies of science in the world, and so on. One just came out on the grave dangers of climate change, signed by, I believe it's more than now 15,000 scientists. The scientific community is trying to speak out. As some of us were talking just before this talk, two of us were in Sydney at a meeting that we organized to try and get the Australian states to stop censoring their ecologists. And the colleague here who was there was told if she went that she would be defunded by the federal government. That sort of stuff is still going on. You citizens are paying for science and then being denied the results of science if they don't happen to conform with the views of certain idiots. So it's something that you should be very much aware of, and Australians ought to be still trying to fight. Now, what's the overall situation from the point of view of me? I believe, as do a bunch of my colleagues, and we've talked a lot about this, that scientists have a set of responsibilities to the general public that goes something like this. First of all, on any issue, you should tell the public what the scientific consensus is. That is, what's the baseline? Second, you should say whether you agree with that consensus or not, and if you don't, why not? What are your data? What are your reasons for disagreeing? And then, after you've said what your view is and why you hold it, you then try and persuade people to do something about it. In other words, the idea that scientists should simply tell the facts, just the facts, ma'am, and not give an opinion on what ought to be done and how one ought to interpret those facts, is simply cutting out of the duties of citizenship the people who have spent most time looking at this in great detail. In other words, how can a Russian asset sitting in the White House say anything about climate change? He doesn't know anything about anything. I mean, this is a man who said, I'm not going to support the Kurds because they didn't fight with us at Normandy. He doesn't even know there were no Kurds at all at Gettysburg. Did you know that? And none of them went across the river with Washington when we threw our past masters out of the United States in 1770, whatever it was. The Kurds have really not deserved our support. Anyway, why should anyone have the slightest interest in what Trump's views on climate or anything else are when he's illustrated, A, he lies all the time, I mean, not one lie a month, one lie a minute, basically, and shows incredible ignorance of absolutely everything, does it deliberately to get his people stirred up. Our government is working as hard as it can at the moment, with the exception of the House Democrats, to destroy the world, to get rid of everything. The worst, what are the big existential threats to humanity? Climate is the one everybody recognizes, almost everybody recognizes. Anybody who can turn on a TV set and watch what's going on in the world can see what's happening with the climate, and it is truly scary. When somebody asked me here the other day, what's it going to be like in Adelaide in the future? What's the climate going to do here? Well, I suggest you read what they've been writing about Qatar. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. There's no U. It's Qatar, where they're now air conditioning the outside. They're burning coal to pump down their shopping malls, not in the just in the shops, but outside. The streets are being air conditioned. Well, it's going to be a little expensive here in Adelaide. I was here some years ago. I don't remember what exact year it was, but it was during one of the Murdoch summers, when it gets very hot. I always honor Rupert because he, more than anyone else, has prevented the world from taking action on climate disruption. He has a thing called the Fox Idiocy Channel or something in the United States. Some of you may have seen a thing called The Australian. Are some of you familiar with The Australian? Well, can somebody tell me why they don't publish it on rolls, in rolls? I mean, it would be so much more convenient. Anyway, so climate change is a serious problem. I didn't set my bezel. How long have I been talking, Corey? What? Hell with it. Anyway, I'll try and hold it to the allotted hour and a half. The climate change problem is extremely serious. It's tied very closely to what Paul mentioned at the beginning, the middle, we're in the sixth mass extinction. And there you don't need any scientific background at all. All you have to know, going back to Charles Darwin, is that every organism evolves into a certain set of conditions. If you keep tropical fish, you know that the tank has to be a certain temperature for certain fish, other temperature for other fish. If you want to breed them, you got to change the temperature. You can't have too acid water. You got to all that sort. If you have a garden, I'm sure all of you with gardens have planted some plant that died off when it got too cold, and some other plant that died off when it got too hot. And so all organisms have to have a certain environment which they're adapted to, which their DNA has adjusted to, in which to develop properly and reproduce. Guess what? When you change all those conditions very, very rapidly, it ain't good for biodiversity. Now, why should we care about biodiversity? Well, the only real reason is that we like to drink water or breathe air or eat, then it's essential. If you don't need any of those things, then not to worry, everything will be just fine. So we have two interacting problems, but we have many others on top of them. It was mentioned in the little bit that Paul said, we are toxifying the entire planet. That's bad enough. If we could examine your blood, any one of you, in great detail, we would find out that it has contents that look like the shelf list in an organic chemistry lab. And we're not sure what the results of that are. One possible result is that the sperm counts are dropping all over the world and nobody is sure why. And that's one of the possible reasons. One of the reasons for the uncertainty is that the basic rule of toxicology, which you all learned in high school, turns out to be wrong. The basic rule of toxicology was that the dose makes the poison. That may not ring a bell with you, but surely you were told sometime in school that common table salt is a poison. If you eat a pound of it, you'll die. And that is the dose makes the poison. But it turns out on many of the synthetic compounds that we're now manufacturing, it's exactly the reverse. They're much more dangerous in tiny quantities than they are in large quantities. And we are dosing everybody. Every time you get one of those receipts out of the cash register, the slippery little things, you're getting a dose of bisphenol A. And we know it's not good for you, but we don't know how not good it is. But it could be that actually we will destroy the sperm counts in human beings. It'll take us back. We'll be talking again about the good old days of the sexual revolution. Remember, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle? Well, I got to be really careful here. Because, first of all, I didn't think to say that the brains of the outfit is sitting in the first row. That's Anne. And the second thing that I should say first all the time is that we are here and in the United States and virtually everywhere else in a world of inequities, and one of the stupidest inequities is the gender inequity issue. In other words, when you realize that we are vastly overpopulated as a world, as a nation in Australia, as a nation in the United States, and you want to do something about it, the very first thing you should do about it, of course, is give women absolutely equal rights, legally equal opportunities, access to modern contraception, as men should have too, and access to absolutely safe abortion if it's necessary. And if you're not working in that direction, if you think that, as our vice president does, that women have an abortion should be thrown in jail, then you're working against the future and against our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And Ann and I have great-grandchildren. I am sleeping with a great-grandmother. If you can't think of that being perverted, I won't tell what she's been doing anyway. But anyway, so the whole situation, there are these existential threats. I could go on and on them, things like the loss of soils. The fact, for instance, that's important to the prime industries of South Australia is that the fertility of soils depends heavily on its earthworm populations, something we've known for a very long time. But what I've just learned is what earthworm populations you get, what earthworms are invasive or wiped out or not, depend very heavily on the climate, not on the soil type, which I had no idea. And most scientists that I know had no idea that was the case. All these things are basically driven by three things. One is, of course, the main thing is the aggregate consumption, how much we use of the Earth's stuff. And how much we use is basically a product of two factors. How many of us there are, population, and our per capita consumption, how much each person on average in a society consumes. And of course, we are sitting here in a high consumption society. The population problem in Australia is much worse because of the consumption patterns of Australians than it would have been if Australians consumed, say, just like Mexicans, so on. So we have that, and then there's a technological factor that goes in also. That is, if your transport is via bike, you don't have the same impact as if it's by a Bentley. And so that's something always to keep in mind. Everybody knows that, but nobody's willing to talk about it. For example, something that I like to quote, and somebody quoted to me the other day, when you're looking at climate disruption, which is what scares everybody and what's helping burn the east coast of Australia and helped almost to burn us fairly recently in the Bay Area in California, population is a huge factor in it. And the best number I know is that if you want to do something in a rich country like this, to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, you want to do something that's environmentally sound, the most important thing everybody could easily do is have one less child. Having one less child saves more greenhouse gases than persuading 22 of your neighbors to give up driving. That's the level. And yet, do you ever hear it? When they talk about the bushfires, I haven't heard anybody say anything about the fact that Australia and the world's overpopulation is contributing in a major way to that. Sorry. Look, there's a lot of things that we could be doing to try and make the coming collapse not so bad, and maybe make it the kind of collapse that something will get through so that we can have a restart of civilization, hopefully with enough knowledge so as not to go through the growth manic session we've just been through for the last few thousand years. And it's only a few thousand years. Remember, Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, been on the planet for roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years. What most people think normal conditions are is the last few hundred years, which are absolutely freaky. It's, as a colleague wrote recently, the explosion stage of a outburst and disappear kind of population cycle. What scientists should be doing much more, and politicians and business people and so on, is getting ready for dealing with a new kind of world. And for example, a group of scientists, which Ann and I were included in, tried to persuade Lausanne, Switzerland, and Palo Alto, California, to get their governments together, their top bank managers, the people who supply the food, the people who get rid of the sewage, everybody who makes the thing a functional entity, and ask the following kinds of questions. Start doing scenarios. What do we do if we only have electricity 2 hours a day? What do we do if the water system only works every third day? What do we do if the flow of food into town is cut by 50%? What do we do? I'm amused always by the people who are pushing having no cash, nothing but credit cards. What do you do with your credit card when there's no electricity? It's going to be kind of tricky. I discovered there are real problems When I try and send somebody a book, when I try and jam it into the USB port of my computer and push send, it doesn't work for some weird reason. Anyway, so there's lots of things that we should be doing to prepare. The things that politicians should be pushing today, if they have the stomach for it, are things that'll be very unpopular. Get rid of cars to the extent that you can. It isn't just the gasoline or the electricity they run on. It costs a lot of materials. You got to do a lot of mining. You got to use a lot of energy to make a car, and then to make highways, and then to build bridges. The United States brilliantly has infrastructure that makes you scared to drive over any bridge because you're no longer doing the maintenance. Imagine trying to say that we're going to put luxury taxes on yachts, airplanes, cars, and so on. We tried that once in the United States. It didn't work at all. Imagine saying that we'll educate your first child for nothing, but you got to pay beyond that, and putting a luxury tax on baby foods. Baby foods, by the way, I could give you a long speech on them, but they're a very bad thing in most respects. They're part of the liquefaction of our diet. The reason you walk around Australia and see most kids have metal in their mouths is because our jaws are shrinking, because we have moved with a Stone Age set of genes into a McDonald's world where probably no one in this room has chewed on a steak within the last 24 hours because the steaks are damn near are bred to be so liquid, hamburgers and so on. And so baby foods are exactly the wrong thing to feed a baby if you want it to mature right. And yet, of course, it's a big business. And if I say that, I'll be undoubtedly sued by a baby food manufacturer. Okay, I think I've gone almost for my half hour, have I not? Yeah. And so I think now is the time to say, I am not totally crazy. I have colleagues who feel the same way, and I think it's really important that all of you get on top of your politicians and get them concerned about the big issues. And at that point, I will now say, what do I say? Oh, I know, amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that informative and engaging presentation. It always amazes me that you're able to get humour into such a dour subject. I'd now like to introduce our panel members for our discussion this evening. First up, we have Professor Carolyn McMillan, Chief Scientist for South Australia. Carolyn is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, and a Bragg member of the Royal Institution of Australia. Dr. Susanna Elliott is the CEO of the Australian Science Media Centre, which is a not-for-profit organisation that supports the accurate reporting of science in the media for the benefit of the Australian public. Susanna has a PhD in cell biology from Macquarie University and a graduate diploma in journalism from the University of Technology in Sydney. And Professor Karen Burke de Silva is the Dean of Education in the College of Science and Engineering here at Flinders University. Karen has led multiple research programs focused primarily on science education. Thank you, Caroline, Susanna, Karen, and Paul, and let me come down and join you. One, two. Let's start with Professor McMillan. Carolyn, how do you think Paul Ehrlich's global views apply to scientists in Australia, and specifically in South Australia? Will it enable us to do better if we listen to what he's saying?
I think in terms of climate, we have no geographic boundaries. We have no reason in which we should limit an interpretation from one jurisdiction, a global view, across to Australia and across to South Australia. To do so would be a rather utilitarian view of a planetary system. And what I do think is that in order to harness the most important elements of a global view is to determine to what extent South Australia has a road to travel to learn from that view, and to what extent has it the value add from the journey it has travelled to contribute to that view. I'm a scientist who firmly believes that knowledge has no boundaries, and in this particular sphere, why would we take anything other than a planetary view?
If we look particularly on the national stage, quite often the argument raised against doing anything for climate change is we're just such a small player, and there are other people out there who are bigger than us and they're doing worse than us, so why should we bother? That goes completely against what you just said.
Indeed, and two things. One is this week would not be a week to argue that in when we watch...
We're not supposed to mention climate change, apparently.
When we see, I think I can mention roaring bushfires, the worst we've ever seen. I think I can mention death and destruction, and I think I can mention that this is on our doorstep, not someone else's. Separately to the piece, it can be applied to all science. We contribute 4% to the world's effort. Why on earth should we bother? Because that 4% leverages 96%, the quality of what we do, the global connectivity of what we have, the way in which that brings knowledge quicker to be harnessed through collaboration into translation to either both build impact for mitigation and to limit the impact of the devastation. So there is no scientist that does not operate globally and does not harness whatever field they are in. My own field is health, and thinking through the public health implications, you do not stop at the borders of South Australia. So not an argument that any scientist could hold.
Let's move along. Karen, you have done a lot of work in environmental education. What's the state of play of environmental education in our school system? Are they getting enough? Are they getting the right messages? Could we be doing more? What should we be doing? A quick sit-rep of environmental education in schools.
I think we're certainly not educating students as we need to be in terms of environmental education, either at schools or at university, for that matter. Specifically at university, we are saying that we are graduating students who have general global views, and yet most students at university don't have to do a science subject. So I think there's a need for all students, both science and non-science students, to gain scientific literacy. So the question is, how do we do that? Do we just throw them into an undergraduate first-year science topic? Probably not the best way to gain scientific literacy. We're still cramming content, scientific facts, in our science teaching. We need to be thinking about teaching critical reasoning, problem solving, and teach the content through that kind of methodology. Going back to primary schools, high schools, many of our teachers, certainly in high schools, still don't really have the background or the updated knowledge to teach science in the way that I think will help students understand about some of the global challenges that we are facing. So again, maybe universities need to work a little bit more closely with schools to try and bring them up to speed.
Okay, and let's introduce Susanna here. And as a science communicator, are you aware of the level of public discourse and the public awareness of the issues around environmental problems? And are they being effectively communicated through the media?
You want the short
Bit of
answer?
a Dorothy Dixer there, really.
Is that on?
Yep.
Yep, good. Look, no, they're not being properly communicated through the media. I think that's, I think we'd all find that that's not the case. I think that it is quite a complicated issue, though, because I wouldn't say that the public is actually ignorant of climate change. And some of the latest polls have shown, actually, that people are very concerned about climate change. It's way more than 60% and growing. Every year there's more and more people that are concerned and want strong action. What I think is much more difficult is for the media and for people to get their head around all of the complexity of all of the different things that are going on, because it's not just climate change, right? We're losing insects, we're losing birds. There are so many different things going on around the world. You talk about toxins. And the problem is that we tend to have very siloed thinking. We think, here's climate change over here, and here's loss of birds and insects over here. Maybe that doesn't matter so much. But actually, all of these things will converge. And we're talking about global environmental change, and that is, I think, a very difficult thing for people to get their head around, and very difficult, actually, for journalists to write about.
It's also, for me, I think that a big problem with science communication is we're still banging on about the inspirational model. If we inspire people with science, then they'll take us seriously. And we've been trying that for the last 70 years and it hasn't worked. Is it time that we start thinking about making the science relevant? If people understand that how it's going to affect them, their kids, their welfare, they're more likely to pay attention than if we try and tell them how wonderful and complex it is.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of the sorts of things that Paul's been talking about, it's not exactly inspiring stuff. It's kind of more like, my gosh, shall I build a bunker now kind of stuff. So I don't think that just inspiring people about science is going to help. However, having said that, there is lots of people like Chris Daniels here, I'm sure would agree that inspiring people about animals and engaging with nature is maybe something that we need to do a lot more of, because we don't appreciate it enough. We really don't appreciate it. But I think that, going back to something that Paul said, it's really important, I think, for scientists to personalise this stuff. That's not to say that they need to go into personal attacks or to start sort of, talking gloom and doom necessarily, because we know that people tend to switch off from that stuff. But, a really good example of that is Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University and the Climate Council. Whenever she gives a talk, she always gives lots of data and lots of stuff that is really quite concerning. But it's really at the end of her talk when she puts up this chart that says, okay, this is where the temperatures are now and this is where they're heading. This is my age here. This is the age that my child will be at my age. And this is the age that her child will be at my age. And you can see from that how personalising it really brings it home, that she's looking at a future for her kids and her grandkids that is really, really scary. And so that's very important, I think.
And I think, Paul, you could probably comment on this with great insight. One reason why scientists in general don't want to get involved is because it attracts attention, and it attracts attention from the wrong people. There's nothing that's going to bring out the trolls quite like standing up there and telling them, hey, we've got to pay attention to the environment, we've got to take climate change seriously. How do you handle the trolls, Paul? I mean, you've had a few in your time.
Yes, I've had a few of the trolls, and Anne has had a few of the trolls. What was just said really is part of the problem and the solution. First of all, one of the biggest problems is that our educational systems have failed. That's not the fault of the teachers or the politicians. Putting blame in there somewhere is not it. I'm at what thinks of itself as one of the best universities in the world. It's looking at the future now, and its future plan, so help me, is to grow at 1.2% a year. That is the plan. They put together 10 dozen committees. The committees stewed around about this stuff. They're doing nothing, basically, because they don't know what to do. They are built into the neoclassical economic in the military, industrial, the whole thing. They're just a working part of it. Now, there are a whole bunch of faculty members in not just in science, but in other departments that are trying to change the world. We have some of the best social psychologists in the world have been at Stanford. Some of you may know the work of Tversky and Kahneman and Ross and so on, who could tell you so much about human behavior, but it isn't translated. And I think one of the biggest problems, these are all cultural norms. What is education? It's something you pour into your kid until they're old enough to get the hell out of the house. Whereas those of you who are scholars or know scientists or so on, these are people who are learning all the time. The problems that all of us face of trying to keep up with this stuff, I really feel for the journalists. And the universities are not, for example, even giving the basic things that they must know. There's a thing called the second law of thermodynamics. Everybody ought to be educated on that, at least at the level that tells you you cannot recycle energy. I'm asked all the time, why don't we just recycle the energy? There can't be any real problem there, right? And that's a common view. So we have not taken ourselves enough to the public. Interestingly, my Australian colleagues are more out front on this than many of my colleagues in the States, because they're saying it's time to get to the streets. That is, we already know and more than enough science to know what we ought to be doing. We already know more than enough science to know that we're not going to change very fast. And we could introduce all kinds of changes using the social scientists' knowledge, which is not spread around, on how to persuade people to do things. I'll give you just one example, then I'll shut up. I'm not even going to give you the name of the scientist because I'm not sure I remember it. Did an interesting experiment. He went and conned a couple of hotels into letting him into their system, and he changed hotel rooms. He put in some of the rooms there was a sign that said, reuse your towels, you'll save the environment. In other rooms, and I'm going to condense a big experiment, in other rooms he put a cat towel thing on the towel rack which said, reuse your towels, most people in this city reuse their towels. And then he put in another room, reuse your towels, most people in this hotel reuse their towels, and in another room it said, reuse your towels, the other people who use this room have used your towels. And the first one, save the environment, didn't make the slightest difference. And then it went on up till something like 85% of the people in the rooms that had the sign that said, other people in this room have reused their towels, got huge response. And then when he did it on energy supply, on energy bills, he would say, people in the city are doing this to save, people in your neighborhood are using this, people your next door neighbors are doing this, and what other people were doing had a huge impact on what you got people to do. There's a lot of stuff they know like that we don't use at all. You know, I got 3 psychologists to talk to the Ecological Society of America, and it made no difference in what they did. It is amazingly difficult to change scholars and scientists' way of doing things, but that's what we've got to do.
Caroline, on stage, you're probably the closest interface with politicians. Why won't some politicians accept evidence?
I think actually it's almost, let's go to 2 features of a politician. One, they're human, one, they're a politician. And I wasn't meaning that in a disingenuously...
It's a very awkward Venn diagram.
Very awkward Venn diagram. But if you take, we've been discussing why, at the community, why people don't somehow translate the evidence into something that's close to them in the way that it's currently communicated to them. So they may see this as something at a distance, which does not necessarily mean to say that they see their daughter or their granddaughter face that. So bringing that story is critical. And I think the piece of evidence is the way science is somehow, and I find this in my role, there's an immediate distancing when you say you're a chief scientist. People take a step back because for many people, particularly of the generation who went through perhaps school maybe 30, 40 years ago, science was technical, it was not connected to life. It was somehow independently a set of rules, which if you learned them, you understood something, but it didn't necessarily cross into life. And if you brought scientists to dinner, you were hoping it wasn't going to be a long night. So reasonably, there is a generational effect where people's experience of science has been being made to feel ill at ease. They'd be asked a technical question, or really remembering the sheer fear of it and the difficulty they had to engage with it. So there's a distancing effect of science itself. And I think actually, interestingly enough, there is a generation now that is going, and I appreciate the translation within high schools, visiting the school here on Flinders University campus, meeting those students, doing projects in science and maths, and about the philosophical, ethical basis from a perspective of telling stories or translating through art, really good science, but using a different medium of communication. This generational difference is something that we can often confuse our miscommunication and human lack of willingness to take evidence. There is a next generation that I think is being prepared better. And when I sat in my previous role, as I did through graduation, at least 12 graduations a year at a university, who always had a speaker speaking on behalf of the graduating cohort, those presentations were remarkable, evidence-based, committed. Independently of what faculty, the world was not going to be based on running business models that caused damage and harm to other communities, or that had a carbon price, which was an untenable price, or that lacked a connection to building the next generation. So I often think there are two audiences, and many of our politicians are in the former. That is, for them, science was distancing. Evidence was based on the technical, and it wasn't their base.
But if I can bring it up to this week's events, I mean, we have the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Premier of New South Wales, slapped about the face with, look, these are bushfires, it's an unprecedented situation, and we've been telling you this has been coming for the last 20 years, and you have been consistently denying it. And even with that in their face, they're still saying, oh, it's the Greenies not allowing us to burn off, or that, they will not accept evidence.
Well, and then we come to the politician. Okay, so we've dealt with, with humanity. Now we come to the politician. Now, I will say, in my experience, that normal distribution to some extent applies. And really, there's nothing you can do at one end of the distribution, because for whatever reason, there is politics trumps evidence. And in that scenario, one hopes that eventually the community will find you out, because there is plenty of evidence that will suggest what you are speaking is rubbish. Okay, so eventually that has to play out. The key group is the group in the middle. The key group is the group who are there trying to represent community views where the community is some way behind the evidence. So it's how do you not get out of step and too far ahead of your community, your constituency. What I like is that this next generation are becoming the community. They are going to require politicians to be in step as the community and the voters. At the moment, politicians have this mismatch. And that, given that they represent the community, given that if they're out of step with the views of the community, they are not in a position, they won't be elected to do anything of value. But that's changing. The intergenerational impact is coming through. I see it frequently about South Australia. We have remarkable next generation young people with businesses and the business, good, strong business model, but utterly not trading on wanting to understand origin, source and provenance of food, of energy, of every piece of their environment. So I think there has been a distancing and a disengagement of one generation. And remember, very few people went to university in the 60s and 70s, and very much fewer of them went to do science. So the distancing effect of science communication is tough. The next generation coming through will hold us to account, is holding us to account very evidently. And there's a fighting chance that as politicians come through from that generation, we will be more in step with the evidence, and that as scientists, we will have told the stories. As Susanna has said, you have to tell the stories. You have to tell the stories that really connect to people, their world, their family, their children.
Karen, if you look at our community leaders, not just in politics, but across the board, they're more likely to have degrees in economics, business, the social sciences, law. There's very few ecologists out there. But particularly when it comes to education, tertiary education in economics, in business, would they benefit from having an ecological component in their educational courses?
Well, of course, absolutely.
I'm not just trying to create a job for you here.
Yes, I'm just going to say. No, it's really interesting. I happened to be at a breakfast this morning with the State Minister of the Environment, and he gave a very impactful talk, and he's doing a lot of really good things. At the end of his presentation, he said when he first got into Parliament, he was hoping he would get any portfolio other than the environment, and it was really something he didn't care about or had any interest in. And I just thought, that's a bit of a shock. You know, our environment minister has no background whatsoever in that area. Now, I give him full credit. He's pulled himself up to speed very quickly, and I'm sure has a lot of good people around advising him. But again, it comes back to this idea of people who go through university, people who go through school, without that scientific literacy, without that basic scientific knowledge, how can they run the country? You know, the biggest global issues at the moment are around science. Yes, these other things I, of course, believe are important as well, but that at least basic background about scientific, well, the process of science, if nothing else, would, I think, be invaluable.
I mean, when I think of when has there been that crossover of introducing ecological messages into business and into economics, the one that springs to mind is when the concept of sustainability, which started in ecology. How do we manage systems so that they can continue at a stable pace? When that translated into the business community, it was about, well, how do we get sustainable profits? How do we get sustainable growth? And it's kind of like, you didn't get the message, did you? You didn't understand what we were talking about, did you? Do you think that there are messages from ecology that we can effectively translate across to business leaders?
I don't think it would really hurt. Now, if we're talking about making money, you have to put it into a mechanism where people can see the point of understanding sustainability, understanding ecology. If they can't see how that reflects the dollar at the end of the day, then they're not going to take it up. So I think, again, it's about translating, and perhaps ensuring that that base understanding is there across the board, and then it's not just about making money, it's about doing the right thing for the planet.
Susanna, they're at the Australian Science Media Centre. It's quite an incredible operation that you've got there, and it's not just because I was once on the board, but that was my way of declaring a conflict. But you deal with journalists across the spectrum. What, you've got something like 3,000 journalists on your lists?
No, closer to 2,000.
Closer to 2,000, but nonetheless, that's a healthy number in Australia. Is there any skewing or in the distribution of the kinds of news outlets that they work for? Do you have as many people from the Australian on the list as you do from the Daily Mail or the Guardian?
Well, I can't give you the exact numbers, but definitely not so many from the Australian. But we do have some from the Australian, and we have some from pretty much all of the mastheads from around the country. So, yep, no, it's a pretty good spread, actually. And News Corp, just to declare another conflict, is one of our sponsors, along with ABC and with Fairfax, now 9. So, yeah, we're supported by pretty much the whole media industry.
What do you do about, or what can you do about organisations? There are newspapers that deliberately have an environment reporter who is anti-climate change.
I think it's incredibly important that we never shut doors. And so we have been an organisation that has always been open to all journalists. And once we, a number of people have suggested to us that we should get into the business of naming and shaming and saying, okay, this journalist, pull them out because they've done the wrong thing. But we know that if we do that, then we will close doors, and we don't want to do that. And there is a certain journalist at the Australian who does report on climate change and who will actually tune into our briefings. And a lot of the time he will actually report what the scientists say. Now, that's far better than if he didn't. He may also report other scientists or other people who have a completely different point of view. But from my point of view, it doesn't matter what outlet it is. You have to be. You've got to have. Scientists have got to have a seat at the table. They're never going to be the sole voice, but they've got to have a seat at the table. And to do that, you've got to keep doors open.
Is there the facility to be able to produce polite corrections of people when they, particularly if they are signed up to the AusSMC and they either misreport something that you've presented to them or any other issue?
Yes, there is. And we often do. And when it comes to factual information, it's actually easier now than ever before to get things corrected. People often just accept stuff in the media, but you can call up a journalist and say, hey, you got that figure wrong by a factor of 10. And they will actually correct it because they can. It's much harder in the newspaper, but these days you can actually, I think a lot of people don't get on to journalists and give them feedback. And tell them when they're doing something good as well as when they've made something wrong, and they can change it.
Paul, you've been, the population bomb came out in 1968. I was fresh out of nappies. Really? And you have been non-stop on these messages for the last, 50, 60 years. Do you feel that the message is getting through? Do you feel that people are listening?
It depends on how you look at it. In other words, when I think how good some things were going during my lifetime, for example, when I was a kid in the 30s, it was common to have people with dark skin killed in the U.S. without any penalties, and you could send a picture of their body on a postcard through the U.S. mail. My first girlfriend in the late 30s had her prospects look like she could be a nurse, a teacher in a low grade, or a secretary, and that would be it. And I took my instrument training as a pilot from a woman. When I joined our department, there was not a single, in the biology department at Stanford, there was not a single woman. Now the strength of our department is in younger women. I'm proud. The only 2 students of mine that ever got into the U.S. National Academy, both female. So there have been some things, or when you looked at, when Joe Louis, who here doesn't know who Joe Louis was? He was the heavyweight champion of the world in the 1930s. He was black. And it was perfectly all right for a newspaper to say, we need a white hope. In other words, things were very different, and they did move in, as far as I'm concerned, the right direction, and some of it has not yet been reversed, although Trump's war on women is going very well. But basically, in my own lifetime, I've seen things change very dramatically in society on all kinds of issues, most recently on the issue of gay marriage in the U.S., all that stuff. What gets me, and I think the vast majority of my colleagues, is if we had 200 more years, we would solve these problems. But no colleague of mine that's close thinks we have more than a decade or so, and thinks that the level of effort ought to be similar to what we've seen. I remember the Second World War. I'm old enough. I was stupid enough to want to fight in it, but fortunately it ended before I had that chance. Societies can change dramatically when they recognize the seriousness of the problem. Up to December 7th, 1941, the U.S. produced almost 4 million passenger cars, and basically after that they didn't produce any for the next few years. They produced tanks and airplanes, and we rationed beef, and we rationed gasoline, and I collected milkweed pods to get the fluff from them, to make life jackets for the military. And then when the war ended, in a year or so, the automobiles were back, the TV sets came online. In other words, we know you can change rapidly if there's the right incentive. And when the time is ripe, human beings can do incredible things. I think the job of all of us is to ripen the time, because we don't have much time, and that's why the scientists are emphasizing and signing on in these thousands to get going, because yes, we could probably solve most of these problems, but we got to face them in a way that's brand new. And so the effort for all of us, the job for all of you, is to try and ripen the time.
To put this across the whole panel, but maybe Caroline, you could lead off on it. And that is that from where I sit, there seems to be 2 types of debates, or 2 cultures. There's a certain political class and certain group of people with them that are in denial of the environmental problems that we have and don't want to do anything about it. But there's also a very active group who do recognise we're in trouble. They do want to know more. They are doing things. They're putting solar panels on their roofs, this, that, and the other. And it seems to me that perhaps it's social media and the online environment that has empowered those people to be able to act that way. Would you agree that we've got this kind of duality in our...
In part, yes, in part. And I really do mean that I think this inflection point of the relevance at becoming irrelevant and becoming relevant is the speed with which you respond to this. And I think those that are emerging as really clearly the new business leaders, the new environmental savvy farmers, food producers, the ones who are just now becoming, I think, into the emerging majority. And when we get that tipping point, that, I think, means that the time for take-up, the time for not for being impatient rather than too patient, the time for seeing the future is different, and really not going near any hotel that would have the audacity to put labels like that on their towels. And they're the market. And markets are actually important in this regard, because there's no market in the next group for anyone that does not share that value base. South Australia is lucky. South Australia has had DNA of social equity and social justice since its foundation. I continually meet those people in that 25, 40-year-old age range. I'm not trying to be ageist here. I'm just simply saying they carry an economic headwind. They're really pulling it through. And in their ability to share that through the social media, to really consider who's got what product that is the product that is going to be the one that they will be drawn to, or the one that they will be able to market, that's a whole new marketplace of views, values, and products. So I see that coming through, and I do see South Australia's leader. I heard it. I was in New South Wales when South Australia was getting absolutely beaten up about the big battery. Well, what a wonderful lesson South Australia has shown Australia. You know, really.
Whoa.
I mean, absolutely. 47%, renewable energy. Being able to be positioned to produce green hydrogen because the science is here, the evidence is here, the renewable energy source is here, and the commitment by the state and its population is here. So while there is a tremendous impact of social media, it can be for bad and it can be for good, there's a relevance piece here, as what you listen to will become the relevant future of the state and of Australia and collectively of the world. And we can't hold that, but there's no stopping that, because that does go across borders. There's a lot of other stuff that goes across borders, but once you get to that tipping point. Now, is that quick enough? Probably not. So we're going to rely on an enormous number of changes in innovation, machine learning applied to climate modelling, the ability to take quantum into computational speeds. We have to speed things up, and we have to look to technologies that speed things up and brains that can deal with the speed at which that's going to go. Some of it we can see, some of it might be plasmonic energy, some of it may be coming at us at left field, but we really do have to speed that new innovation approach up, and I do see the appetite for that in this emerging generation. And business is important in it, and there are lessons learned, and reasonably that has to not, those lessons have to continue to speed up the regulatory frameworks.
Karen, this change for the better, we're not being led through this change. It seems to be a groundswell from the more educated population. Are the messages getting out fast enough, do you think?
I'm not so sure I'm as positive as Caroline. Again, I think we're moving very slowly. When we think about when we, in South Australia, said we can't be given plastic bags in grocery stores, I mean, pretty tiny thing. You would think that everybody would have just, of course, accepted that, trying to spread that around the rest of the country, and people are rebelling. How dare you tell me I'm not allowed to bring, shop with a plastic bag? We're also finding that the councils are doing everything differently about recycling. If we had a standard across the board, these are the bins that you put these different recyclables, garbage, whatever, then people might know what to do. They might be able to follow it. We could put it on the packaging. The people who are making the compostable material say that 95% of their compostable items are still being thrown in the garbage bin. We can't even get this level of thing done right. So I don't know if social media or any other media is what's getting us there fast enough. I think perhaps we need government and communities to just start mandating things and do it across the board, and then people will know what to do, because I think they want to do it. A lot of people are ready to do it, and yet they're very confused about how to do it. So we need to make it easier for them to get things rolling very quickly.
Susanna, you've been at the Science Media Centre more than 10 years now.
Nearly 15.
Nearly 15 years. Have you noticed any change in the way that ecology and environmental issues have been reported? Are we still doing it the same way that we used to, or has there been some kind of change, and what is that change?
I mean, social media has definitely changed the landscape. There's no doubt about that. But we also have to remember that it was social media that got Trump elected. I think that's had a big role to play anyway. And it's also, you know, it's an avenue for a hell of a lot of misinformation, fake news. So I think that unfortunately social media has probably muddied the water quite a lot. And so that's obviously been a really big change. Having said that, it also is an amazing way for people of similar views, both not so good and great, you know, good, can actually coalesce. And so it can be an incredibly positive form of change. I think that, sadly, you know, I feel like the communication kind of goes up and down, and a lot of it does have to do with the politics. Australian media is very much driven by the political situation. It's not driven by science. It's driven by politics. And so when politicians say things about science, then suddenly the media is reporting on it. If they don't say anything about science, then they don't report on it. And so I can think back on a time, you know, 10 years ago or more, when actually there was a lot, it felt to me that there was a lot more information actually out there. Everybody was talking about climate change. People were having dinner conversations about it. It was in the media all the time. Now we're starting to see that again after a long sort of hiatus, a lot of period of time when it went kind of quite quiet. But now I think that we're, you know, because, you know, people are becoming more aware, perhaps partly through social media. Politicians do have to deal with climate change, so they are talking a lot more about it. And now we're starting to see a lot more in the media. But I think that, you know, coming back to this issue of environmental science and climate being a highly politicised issue, I think that's probably the biggest disaster, I think, in terms of the communication of this issue. And it doesn't have to be that way. Why should the environment be a left-right issue? It shouldn't be. And I think that, you know, that's terribly unfortunate. There are many countries where it's not the case. And I think Australia, it's a very, very sad thing that it's become so polarised here, and we've seen that in the last few days. It's terrible, and that impacts on the way that these issues are communicated to the broader community. And if they see themselves as being either left-wing or right-wing, then they will move themselves towards an opinion on environmental science which fits with their political values, and that's a tragedy.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've covered an awful lot of territory this evening, some of it inspirational, some of it rather depressing, but nonetheless, I think we've all learned a heck of a lot from our wonderful panel. So please, a big round of applause for Karen, Caroline, Paul and Susanna. And while you're in the clapping mood, there are two groups that I do think we need to mention. First of all, the good people at Flinders University who made tonight an event. Thank you very much for that. And also the people from a group called Science Meets Parliament South Australia. I know that a couple of them are here in the front row. If it wasn't for Science Meets Parliament South Australia, they brought Paul Ehrlich to Adelaide so that tonight's event could actually happen. So let's hear it for them as well. Thank you all for coming along tonight. If you take anything away, it's that it's up to each and every one of us to do our bit. Get active, get out there, do something positive, and something positive will happen. Thank you very much for coming along tonight.